Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to Victorian London, where the streets are cobbled, the fog is eternal, and the toys? Well, let's just say your childhood light bright would not have survived 5 minutes. You step off a horse drawn omnibus, your boots crunching on a mix of coal dust and discarded toffee wrappers. Children dart between carts and carriages, their cheeks smudged with soot and their arms cradling what appear to be tiny cannons. That's right. Welcome to the Bang Age, when playtime often meant sparks, smoke, and the very real possibility of singed eyebrows. Back then, toys weren't just about fun. They were about building character. And if you could build character while also accidentally igniting your sister's pinafore, all the better. You're quickly learning that safety wasn't a top priority in 19th century Britain. After all, this was an age when arsenic made wallpaper more vibrant and children worked factory jobs before they lost their baby teeth. You probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little time machine travels. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself outside a toy maker's shop, tucked between a fishmonger and a place advertising leeches for the ladies. The windows of the toy shop glitter with tin soldiers, rocking horses, and something that looks suspiciously like a miniature trebuchet. Inside, it smells of varnish and scorched felt. A boy with wild hair and a suspicious number of burns on his sleeves shows you his latest treasure, a pop gun loaded with actual powder caps. Not confetti, not air pressure, gunpowder. The idea is simple. Fire a loud, satisfying bang when the trigger's pulled. The result? A household full of startled adults and one child grinning like he's just invented thunder. This wasn't a fluke. Victorian manufacturers leaned into the drama. Noise equaled excitement, and excitement equaled sales. You can practically hear the shopkeeper muttering, "Ah, yes." Nothing like a mild explosion to teach hand-eye coordination. Historians still argue whether these toys were truly meant for fun, or if they served another purpose. Perhaps easing young boys into the mindset of military service, which, by the way, could start as young as 12. The line between play and training was hazy. Meanwhile, girls weren't left out of the danger. While their toys were marketed as gentler, they too had their surprises. Some dolls came with accessories like candles or sulfur tablets for housekeeping lessons. Because what better way to simulate adulthood than by setting a pretend fireplace ablaze on the parlor floor? You head further down the street, following the sound of... Was that a small detonation? A group of children huddle near a park bench, passing around a tin canister that lets out a stream of sparks. One girl carefully measures something from a paper sachet. The label reads, Professor T. Nizzlewick's Pyrostatic Learning Powder, a most educational spectacle. Ah yes, educational. You might think these fiery playthings would be banned, but Victorian society had a high tolerance for chaos in the name of curiosity. There was an unspoken motto. If it didn't kill you, it probably built character. Still, not every parent was thrilled. Some wrote letters to the Times, complaining that these toy infernos were corrupting the youth or frightening the neighborhood dogs. Others, however, embraced it. After all, what better way to prepare little Timmy for empire building than by arming him with a flint and spark mortar? You pause at a corner where a poster advertises Christmas stocking stuffers, now with 40% more pop. Below it, a smaller sign reads, Please supervise children under 4. You try not to laugh. 4. Quirky as it sounds now, there was a deep cultural undercurrent here. The Victorian era was one of discovery, of steam and spark, of pushing boundaries, sometimes literally, with an exploding inkwell. Toys reflected that spirit. If grown men could invent locomotives and telegraphs, why shouldn't children dabble in a little combustion of their own? You stroll back toward the toy shop, the smell of spent matches and coal smoke lingering in the air. The boy from earlier waves at you, his pop gun tucked under his arm like a beloved pet. He's off to terrorize his nanny with another round of indoor thunder. You shake your head, amused, maybe a little horrified, but also oddly charmed. There's something disarmingly sincere about a time when curiosity was sparked, literally, and no one questioned giving small explosives to kids as long as they promised to share with their siblings. The sun dips behind the smoky rooftops, casting the city in a warm, ash-colored haze. Bells ring in the distance. Maybe a church, maybe an alarm. You really can't tell anymore. Welcome to the bang age, friend. You head down a quieter lane now, your shoes crunching on gravel and bits of spent firecrackers. Victorian London may be soot-filled and stern-faced, but its children are anything but, especially when armed with toy guns loaded with real gunpowder. At the center of this next scene is the humble cat pistol, a small, unassuming object that looks like something out of a Wild West daydream. It's made of cast iron or tin, maybe painted to look vaguely like silver, but don't be fooled. The click of the trigger is followed by a sharp, ear-piercing crack, thanks to the little strip of red paper caps tucked inside, each laced with a sprinkle of actual gunpowder. You find yourself crouching beside a trio of boys reenacting the siege of somewhere probably colonial. The rules of the game? Whoever shouts, "Boom!" the loudest gets to be general. Historically accurate, not in the slightest. Dangerous, entirely. One boy hands you a freshly loaded pistol, his cheeks glowing with mischief. You decline politely, your eyebrows still intact and unscorched. These toys weren't always the precise, safety-inspected plastic things we know today. Back then, misfires were frequent, and sometimes the metal cracked under pressure. Literally. Still, that never stopped kids. In fact, the louder the pop, the better. Some children even improved their pistols by modifying them, adding extra powder, wrapping them tighter, or aiming at tin cans with the full enthusiasm of a fledgling artillery officer. And sometimes, yes, things went kaboom in the way only overexcited science can. Historians still argue whether these toy guns were a symptom of a militaristic culture or simply a reflection of the Victorian love for all things mechanical. After all, this was an empire where steam engines, railways, and warships were the pride of the nation. A noisy toy gun? That was just entry-level patriotism. Cap pistols weren't alone. Other noisy companions included snappers, tiny paper twists filled with silver fulminate. You'd throw them to the ground and wait for the satisfying pop. Children loved them. Adults, less so, especially when they found them tucked between the pages of their morning paper. But the pièce de résistance of any young Victorian's arsenal was the parlor cannon. You raise your eyebrows, and rightly so. It was, in effect, a real miniature cannon. Metal barrel, little fuse, and all. Sold under the pretense of educational amusement, it allowed children to launch projectiles across the drawing room. Sometimes corks, sometimes marbles. Occasionally, walnuts. The packaging often included charming illustrations. A boy firing the cannon while his sister claps politely, and his mother pours tea nearby, entirely unfazed by the military-grade hardware aimed at the sideboard. You pass a group of children lining up tin soldiers on a windowsill. One of them mutters something about tactical positioning, and then, with the solemnity of a general, lights a fuse. The resulting pop knocks over exactly 0 soldiers, but everyone cheers anyway. It's not about precision, it's about drama. A nearby parent leans out the window and shouts, "Keep it down!" And don't aim at the cat this time. He's not joking. Cats in this era lived lives of constant surprise. There's a curious mix of respect and recklessness here. These were toys that mimicked adult tools, military ones in particular, and playing with them gave kids a fleeting sense of control in a world that often treated them as small, silent laborers. With a toy pistol, a child could command attention just for a moment. They could shape noise and direction. It was power, pocket-sized. And make no mistake, these were not cheap novelties. Some cap guns were mass-produced for the general public, but others were ornate, even beautiful. Embossed handles, detailed engravings, and custom holsters meant that even the gentry's children could get in on the explosive action, albeit with more polished accessories. You notice an older boy, clearly proud of his gleaming brass pistol. He shows you how he rolls the cap strip just right to get the biggest bang without jamming the chamber. You nod like you're impressed, even though your modern sensibilities are quietly horrified. You'd be hard-pressed to find a 10-year-old today casually managing explosive compounds. And yet, these toys were often praised for being character-building. If you could fire a cap gun without flinching, you were on your way to manhood, or at least to an apprenticeship in munitions. The practice had its odd side effects. Some schools banned cap pistols not for safety, but because the noise disrupted recitation. A few teachers reportedly used the toys themselves. Yes, really, to get attention in overcrowded classrooms. Nothing says quiet down like the sound of a small explosion next to the globe. By now, dusk is settling. The street lamps flicker to life, bathing the cobblestones in a warm, hazy glow. But the children are still out, still popping caps and reenacting battles no one fully remembers. You spot one boy aiming his cap gun at the evening sky, announcing a salute to Her Majesty. A spark, a snap, and a grin. You shake your head, amused again. There's something both absurd and endearing about it all. These weren't just toys. They were training grounds for curiosity, chaos, and maybe a few minor concussions. And as you head toward the next smoke-fringed alleyway, you can't help but wonder, what else did the Victorians think was perfectly safe for children? You wander deeper now, into the backyards and parlors of Victorian families, where a particular kind of mischief simmers beneath the surface. One involving matches, wax, and the kind of parental optimism that assumes small children won't set fire to their own eyebrows. Tonight's exhibit, the wildly popular magic lantern, kits, and phosphorus-based chemistry sets, which despite their charming names, basically handed children the keys to a very tiny, very cheerful apocalypse. Let's start with the magic lantern. Picture an old-fashioned slide projector, but steam-powered and unpredictable. Inside, a small flame. Yes, an actual open flame illuminates a glass slide etched with colorful images. The heat from the lamp sends these images flickering across a wall or ceiling, creating the illusion of movement. Ghosts shimmer. Demons leap. Educational diagrams, somehow still spooky, float eerily by. You crouch in one dim sitting room as two sisters dim the curtains, load a slide showing Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, and crank the lantern into action. The room fills with smoke and laughter. You cough gently and blink through a fog of sulfur. The magic lantern was meant to be educational, a visual aid to explain geography or Bible stories. But in practice, it was a child-powered horror show. Slides were often homemade, etched onto fragile glass by amateur hands. One popular set showed diseases of the skin in lurid detail, while another walked you through the lives of famous criminals, complete with gallows. Historians still debate whether the magic lantern was a proto-cinema or a Victorian fever dream. Some say it inspired a love of science. Others argue it just gave children nightmares and the occasional singed fingertip. But if the lantern was eerie, chemistry sets were outright madness in a velvet-lined box. You tiptoe into a bedroom where a boy in starched pajamas is combining white powder with blue liquid under a wobbly magnifying glass. His little sister holds a candle nearby for better lighting. You wisely step back. These kits were sold under cheerful names like Doctor, Piffle's Scientific Amusements, and Young Chemist's Discovery Cabinet. And they came packed with real chemicals. Potassium nitrate, sulfur, magnesium, and, yes, good old-fashioned phosphorus, the same kind used in early matches and, if you're not careful, small explosions. Children learned to create volcanoes, concoct foul-smelling gases, and make their own fireworks, usually with recipes printed in charming fonts next to drawings of smiling cherubs. The more enthusiastic kits encouraged you to astound your friends, with a powder that ignites on contact with water, which it did, frequently, and with flair. You crouch beside a table where a half-finished experiment bubbles ominously. The instructions say to add 2 spoonfuls of solution C. The boy adds 4. His reasoning? It makes a bigger fizz. You nod slowly and begin calculating how fast you can run. One experiment proudly claims to demonstrate the formation of synthetic diamonds. What it actually creates is a scorched mess and a smell that lingers in wallpaper for weeks. Another set promised a tornado in a jar, which turned out to be a swirling soup of vinegar, ink, and fury. Incredibly, these sets were often recommended by teachers and physicians alike. They were seen as wholesome, engaging ways to occupy children, preferably boys, indoors. Better to be mixing volatile powders in the attic than, heaven forbid, lounging idly or reading novels about pirates. And it wasn't just upper-class families getting in on the scientific chaos. Even modest households saved up to buy home laboratories, kits that often came with real glass test tubes and beakers, along with no safety goggles whatsoever. Eyelashes were considered a renewable resource. You peer through the haze at a manual open on the floor. One chapter is called How to Create Thunder Indoors. Another, Chlorine Fountains, Delightful and Surprising. A helpful footnote adds, Do not inhale directly. You stifle a cough. Of course, children being children, they rarely followed instructions. Many simply mixed everything together, just to see what would happen. And something usually did. Some experiments turned their hair green. Others dyed the family cat a startling shade of purple. One popular anecdote tells of a child creating a goo so adhesive it permanently bonded 2 teacups, which the family later passed off as modern art. Historians still argue whether this widespread embrace of dangerous science reflects the era's obsession with progress or a profound lack of adult supervision. Possibly both. You tiptoe out of the room, now glowing faintly green for reasons unknown. Outside, you pass a boy, showing off a small glass vial that contains something labeled dragon's breath. You don't ask. You just smile, nod, and keep walking. What's striking is how normal it all seemed. These weren't fringe activities. This was mainstream fun. Catalogs advertised them with phrases like charming winter amusement or a fireless firework for sensitive children, which is an oxymoron if there ever was one. You overhear a group of kids debating whether sulfur smells worse than ammonia. One insists it's like old eggs. Another claims it's ghost breath. They all lean in to sniff again, utterly delighted. You, wisely, hold your breath. At least once a week, a newspaper ran a story about a small incident involving a bedroom experiment gone wrong. Most ended harmlessly, some less so. One boy reportedly blew a hole through his desk and earned the lifelong nickname Bang Bang Birdie. He considered it a badge of honor. You step over a scorched rug and past a giggling child stirring something ominous in a teacup. It's easy to forget just how wild the Victorian age was. How casually it handed its children the tools of invention, destruction, and delight, all in one velvet-lined box. And yet, beneath all the fizzing, crackling chaos was a kind of magic. A belief in discovery, in wonder, in the idea that even children could tinker with the unknown and maybe, just maybe, light up the world. Ideally, without burning it down in the process. Now, you step into a neatly wallpapered nursery, where danger wears a smile and comes with instructions. It's a bright and tidy place, with rocking horses, alphabet blocks, and, oh look, a toy cannon the size of a small dachshund. Tonight, you're entering the glorious realm of Victorian toys that moved, pulled, pushed, cranked, or, if you were especially lucky, fueled by actual combustion. Yes, you've heard of wind-up toys, but these were wind-up toys with ambition and gunpowder. Let's begin with one of the stars of the toy chest, the miniature cannon. It was considered a charming gift for boys with military inclinations. a phrase that feels very innocent until you're watching a 10-year-old fire lead pellets across a drawing room. These little cannons came with iron wheels, a hinged breech, and often a set of highly flammable gunpowder caps. The goal? To knock down toy soldiers, glass bottles, or, occasionally, Aunt Prudence's favorite vase. You crouch beside a pair of brothers aiming one across the parlor. They've stacked books as barricades and drawn a battle plan on the back of a hymn pamphlet. One lights the fuse with a match. You retreat, slowly and silently, as the cannon emits a shockingly loud pop and sends a cork flying into the wall. They cheer. You flinch. Historians still argue whether these toys were genuinely educational or just cleverly disguised mischief machines. Some claim they taught hand-eye coordination and physics. Others, more realistically, note that they mostly taught children how to scorch the carpet and lie convincingly about it. Not far from the battlefield, you spot another miracle of mechanical mayhem: steam-powered locomotives. Miniature trains, real metal ones, designed to puff along little tracks on your living room floor. They ran on a small water boiler, heated with alcohol or paraffin. That's right, actual fire. In the nursery. You kneel beside a set now. The engine hisses. The tracks tremble. You can smell the heat. And you realize that Victorian parents willingly set up what was essentially a tiny, highly pressurized bomb between their children and a basket of biscuits. A mainstream fact: one popular model, sold in the 1870s, could reach speeds of over 10 miles per hour and required careful monitoring to avoid overboiling. Quirky tidbit: some enterprising kids repurpose the steam to warm up tea or power tiny saws for woodworking. It's fun and functional until someone gets scalded. Victorian catalogs promoted these engines with phrases like "a delight for the inquiring boy" and "safe for parlor use, with caution." A few even boasted about having a pressure release valve, which is the 19th century equivalent of "don't worry, it probably won't explode." You turn your head as a loud pop echoes from the other side of the room. A girl in a ruffled pinafore has just launched a tiny hot air balloon indoors. These toys were often made of silk and wire, heated underneath with a candle or alcohol lamp. The idea was that hot air would lift the balloon slowly and gracefully, inspiring awe and imagination. The reality? Most ascended 4 feet before tilting sideways and singeing someone's curtains. You help her retrieve the balloon from a wall sconce. She giggles and says, "That one went better than last time." You don't ask what happened last time. There were also exploding caps, of course, tiny percussion devices that made a satisfying crack when struck with a hammer or fired from a toy pistol. One manufacturer proudly advertised their 50-shot repeater, which made it sound like a carnival game, but really just turned a normal afternoon into the soundtrack of a very polite revolution. Toy pistols were enormously popular, with names like Little Bang, the Thunderer, and, somewhat ominously, the Peacekeeper. Most came in bright tins or brass, with delicate triggers and tiny hammers. Kids loved them. Parents tolerated them. Postmen feared them. And it wasn't just weapons and wheels. You cross the room and find a girl with a wind-up doll that walks and waves a fan. Its inner mechanism clicks faintly, and its eyes roll back a little too far into its porcelain skull. Charming. Slightly cursed. Deeply Victorian. These mechanical dolls were the stuff of wonder and occasional nightmares. Some could play music boxes from inside their torsos. Others blinked, turned their heads, or clapped their hands. The more ambitious ones, built by Parisian toy makers, were almost unsettlingly lifelike, until they malfunctioned and began spinning in circles or laughing at inappropriate times. Victorian children loved them anyway. They weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for movement, magic, and mayhem. Historians still debate whether these automaton toys were precursors to robotics or just expensive hazards in petticoats. Either way, they were coveted. And when one broke, it wasn't thrown away. It was taken to a doll hospital, an actual place where men in waistcoats repaired blinking glass eyes and rewound tiny music box hearts. A girl next to you carefully winds up her doll's parasol. The mechanism sticks, clicks, and finally springs open, startling both of you. She beams. You offer an encouraging nod, discreetly checking your eyebrows for scorch marks. Then there were fireworks. Yes, actual fireworks. Victorian children were allowed to purchase small firecrackers, especially on holidays, and light them in the street. Popular ones included squibs, crackers, and devil chasers, which were small, noisy, and designed to chase you by accident. You dodge one now, fizzing along the floorboards like an angry worm. No one seems alarmed. Some parents saw this as good, clean fun. Others, likely the ones with singed doorsteps, lobbied for restrictions. Eventually, local governments began banning certain types of home fireworks. But enforcement was spotty, and most kids simply adapted by lighting them in secret behind the stables. So you stand there, surrounded by laughter, smoke, and the soft ticking of barely regulated machinery. And you realize something odd. This chaotic play was also, somehow, deeply innocent. It wasn't about destruction. It was about curiosity, about testing the world, one puff of smoke at a time. Still, you take one final step back from the cannon, just in case. Now you find yourself kneeling beside a stained rag rug, the floor beneath it creaking faintly with every movement. The air smells of soot and boiled starch. A little boy in a sailor suit has just unveiled his newest treasure, a magic lamp that runs on kerosene. Spoiler alert, it's not really magic. It's just very, very flammable. Tonight's tour takes us deeper into the Victorian household, not just the nursery, but the places where toys spilled into hallways, parlors, and even kitchens. Why? Because many Victorian playthings weren't confined to a tidy toy box. They bled into everyday life. Because of course they did. Take, for example, the toy chemistry sets that became popular with upper-class boys in the 1880s. A standard kit might include magnesium ribbons, potassium nitrate, and instructions for making invisible ink, green fire, or harmless rockets. The last of which was a generous overstatement. One enthusiastic 12-year-old wrote in his diary that he had created a fizzing green gel that set fire to mothers' doilies, but glowed quite agreeably. Progress. Historians still argue whether these chemistry kits were part of a larger educational push, or simply a way to keep boys busy so they wouldn't saw holes in the banister. Some say they were inspired by the Industrial Revolution's spirit of experimentation. Others suspect it was just capitalism in a waistcoat, looking to cash in on childhood curiosity with an occasional side of singed eyebrows. You pass into a kitchen now where a group of girls are playing house. Their toy ovens, real metal, fueled by spirit burners. They're baking tiny cakes in brass pans while a small flame flickers beneath the grate. One girl is calmly adding nutmeg. Another is poking a pastry with a skewer. No one is wearing oven mitts. Naturally. The toy stoves, often modeled after modern ranges, could reach shocking temperatures, hot enough to cook small meals. In fact, some middle-class mothers encouraged their daughters to use them for real tea service, since it doubled as practice for their eventual lives of genteel domesticity. And if someone's fringe caught fire in the process, well, that was part of growing up, wasn't it? Nearby sits a tea set made of uranium glass. It glows faintly green in the sunlight, a fun party trick that decades later would be considered less ideal. But during the Victorian period, uranium oxide was prized for its vibrant hue. You imagine a child pouring a pretend tea into a cup that's just a little bit radioactive. Cheers! And let's not forget the sparking toys. One popular item in 1890 was the flint beetle, a small metal insect that, when wound and released, would skitter across the floor, spewing sparks from its rear end. It was adored by children, loathed by maids, and probably responsible for at least a few scorched floorboards. You watch as one buzzes past your foot like a very angry cockroach with a party trick. A boy nearby shows you his voltaic frog, an experiment kit that demonstrates galvanic reactions by applying current to a preserved frog leg. You decline to participate. The boy insists it's perfectly scientific. The frog disagrees. One of the oddest toys in this blurry line between education and danger was the early X-ray playset. Not quite the real deal, but still based on radium-based phosphorescent materials. These novelty X-ray viewers promised to let children see the bones in their hands. Mostly, they just emitted a faint green glow, and a whole lot of questions from future radiologists. Now you slip quietly into the parlor, where a group of children is putting on a Punch and Judy show. The puppets are made of painted wood, their noses exaggerated, and their voices performed through little swazzle reeds. What's interesting, though, isn't the show. It's what's behind the curtain. Fireworks. Some traveling puppet sets included small firecrackers for dramatic effect. One version of the Punch show included an actual puff of smoke when the crocodile appeared. You peek backstage. There's a child crouched with a match and a wide grin. You step back. Quirky tidbit? Some households trained the family parrot to mimic Punch's voice, so it could provide commentary long after the puppet show ended. Imagine trying to do your schoolwork with a bird screaming, "That's the way to do it," every 5 minutes. As you leave the puppet show, a boy offers you a chance to try his electric shock machine. It's a hand-crank device that delivers a tiny jolt when the circuit completes. He claims it improves circulation. You politely decline because you've read Frankenstein and know how this ends. The Victorian fascination with electricity reached into toys, too. Some dollhouses included working electric lights, powered by small exposed wires and homemade batteries. These weren't marketed as dangerous, so much as advanced. Some even came with little light switches, which inevitably led to mischief. More than one parent reportedly found themselves in the dark when Junior rerouted the parlor's current into his train set. And speaking of electricity, you stumble upon one of the oddest inventions yet, a toy electrotherapy wand. Sold as both a health device and a novelty, this crank-powered wand claimed to deliver curative vibrations through mild shocks. Children were encouraged to treat their dolls, their pets, or themselves. Historians still debate whether this was medical ambition or just creative cruelty disguised as science. You finally step into a sunlit back room, where a group of siblings is trying out their newest game, Storm the Fort. It involves a cardboard fort, marbles as cannonballs, and, of course, actual gunpowder caps for sound effects. The instructions suggest using string to simulate smoke. The children, predictably, use matches. So here you are, surrounded by wonder, invention, and things that should absolutely not be this flammable. You watch a child in lace-up boots blow gently on a tiny forge while her brother stirs tea over an open flame. It's strange, it's reckless, it's utterly endearing. And you realize, with a slow smile, that Victorian children weren't fearless. They were simply given the tools to explore, and then left unsupervised. A dangerous combination, a magical one. You tiptoe down a narrow stairwell now, following the echo of distant giggles and the unmistakable tick-tick whir of gears and springs. A new corner of Victorian playtime awaits, one full of steam, brass, and far more ambition than safety labels would ever allow. Yes, it's time to meet the world of mechanical toys. At the heart of it all is the steam-powered miniature locomotive, a gleaming marvel no larger than a baguette and roughly twice as dangerous. One sits on a circular track in a nursery, huffing clouds of warm vapor as it rattles forward, just a bit too fast for comfort. A child chases after it with the glee of someone unaware that boiler explosion is even a concept. These steam toys were more than novelties. They were engineering lessons disguised as amusement. The engines actually ran on alcohol burners or small coal pellets, complete with working pistons and flywheels. Historians still argue whether the average child learned anything practical from them, or just learned not to put their hand on a hot boiler twice. Either way, one wrong twist of a valve, and you had a toy that doubled as a scalding teapot. In the corner, a girl winds up her mechanical swan. It glides elegantly across a porcelain basin, dipping its beak into the water with uncanny grace. The mechanism inside is a marvel of tiny gears and hand-formed brass. Its elegance is undeniable. So is the fact that it's sharp enough to slice through a crumpet. Victorian toys didn't come with disclaimers. They came with consequences. You pause beside a polished oak case containing what looks like a child-sized guillotine. But relax. It's not for people. It's a toy for slicing bread or cutting paper dolls. Still, it works. It really works. And you'd be forgiven for feeling just a little uneasy as you watch a child line up a paper soldier with methodical glee. Victorian children loved mechanical illusions. There were zoetropes and phenakistoscopes, spinning devices that brought still images to life. You watch as a girl spins hers and watch as a man ride a galloping horse in endless loop. Historians still debate whether these devices inspired early film or were simply the era's answer to screen time. Either way, it's hypnotic and slightly dizzying. Near the fireplace, you find another mechanical wonder, a writing doll. The child sets it on the table, winds the key, and the tiny automaton dips a metal quill in ink and begins to scrawl letters across the page. Well, sort of. The results are often shaky and endearing, like a goose learning cursive. These dolls fascinated Victorian audiences, blurring the line between plaything and proto-robot. Some parents thought they were magical. Others thought they were a little too lifelike for comfort. Next up, the perpetual motion machines. Of course, none were truly perpetual. Physics had its limits, even in 1892. But that didn't stop toy makers from trying. One boy proudly shows you his ever-rolling sphere, a metal ball that seems to glide endlessly around a track using a hidden magnet. It's part toy, part scam, and fully beloved by children too young to grasp Newtonian betrayal. And yes, there were toy elevators, miniature lifts made from pulleys and counterweights, often installed inside elaborate dollhouses. These weren't just for fun. They were demonstrations of mechanical principles. At least, that's what the brochures said. In reality, they were usually used to hoist cookies into upper-story doll parties. A noble cause, if you think about it. You pass a boy in tweed shorts testing his jumping jack, a jointed paper puppet attached to strings and levers. He yanks it with enthusiasm, and the figure flails wildly, like a startled squid. In its own way, it's a perfect metaphor for Victorian play. All limbs in motion, slightly alarming, and powered by unspoken mischief. On the table sits a hand-cranked, chattering teeth contraption. Not plastic, but metal, and just a little too loud. A little too aggressive, a little too sharp. It chatters its way off the table and lands at your feet, still grinning like it knows something you don't. Quirky tidbit. There was even a mechanical rat that would skitter across the floor on tiny wheels, its tail made of real horsehair. Historians aren't sure whether this was a prank, a toy, or a way to train cats for domestic service. Probably all three. And who could forget the wind-up horseman? These toys featured a tin soldier on horseback, galloping in circles with alarming speed. If they hit a table leg, they often rebounded with unexpected vengeance. Many a Victorian slipper was lost in battles against rogue cavalry units. You stop beside a model Ferris wheel. A child cranks the handle, and the seats swing gently around in perfect motion. It's soothing, rhythmic, possibly safe. But then the child winds faster, and the wheel begins to rattle. You take a careful step back, because Victorian bearings are not known for long-term loyalty. These mechanical marvels weren't just toys. They were status symbols, often imported from France or Germany. Wealthy families prided themselves on having the latest automata, which were sometimes so complex that they required their own instruction booklets. And when the gears jammed, you called in a toy maker or a very brave uncle with a screwdriver and no survival instinct. One final stop before the hallway, a child's desk with a mini typing machine. It doesn't type letters so much as punch holes in paper in the vague shape of the alphabet. Still, it's enough to send a make-believe telegram or destroy one's will to spell. Historians still argue whether this toy helped literacy or simply made Morse code even more confusing than it already was. You sit for a moment on a velvet cushion, watching the room whirl with motion. Wheels spinning, metal clicking, flames flickering, children shouting with delight. It's a little overwhelming, a little magical, and just a little dangerous. But as you sink into the cushion and listen to the wind-up lull of gears and laughter, you begin to see what they saw. Not chaos, not risk, but motion, possibility. A future full of strange and beautiful machines, all humming towards something brighter. The room quiets for a moment as the air grows heavier, thick with the scent of polished wood and wax candles. You pad softly across a creaky floorboard into what seems, at first, like a craft room. But no, it's something more. This is the realm of Victorian chemistry sets, a child's laboratory tucked into a shadowy alcove, cluttered with beakers, brass burners, and dreams far bigger than the average parent probably realized. On the center table, a boy in a ruffled collar strikes a match and lights a spirit lamp. The blue flame flickers calmly, and he carefully positions a small glass retort above it, his tongue sticking out in concentration. You lean closer. Inside, a crystalline substance begins to bubble gently. "Just making salt crystals," he says. Then with a gleam in his eye, he adds, "But yesterday I tried gunpowder." Yes, dear listener, gunpowder, available apparently at your nearest respectable Victorian toy shop. The 19th century was an age of boundless curiosity, and nowhere was that more explosively obvious than in the rise of educational toys. Chemistry sets were sold as tools of enlightenment, a hands-on introduction to the mysteries of the natural world. They were packaged in sturdy wooden boxes, often velvet-lined, with names like The Little Chemist or Professor Merriweather's Magic Matter Kit. A charming name until you notice that half the vials are marked with things like sulfur, niter, and aqua fortis, aka nitric acid. One popular activity was the volcanic reaction, where children were instructed to combine vinegar and chalk, or, in some braver sets, potassium chlorate and sugar. Historians still debate whether these sets were primarily about science education or simply a roundabout way to reduce the number of curtains in a household. You crouch beside a girl, fiddling with a tin of powdered magnesium. She sprinkles a pinch on a spoon, holds it over the flame, and phoom, a blinding white flare erupts. She claps with joy. You blink rapidly and reevaluate your understanding of the word supervision. Victorian children didn't need supervision. They needed lab coats and fire insurance. Of course, not all chemistry toys were about combustion. Some included activities for making perfumes, soaps, or even early forms of plastic. But as you watch a boy struggle to clean sulfur stains off his waistcoat, you begin to suspect that most hygiene experiments ended in a smell best described as enthusiastically rotten eggs. In the corner sits a device that looks like a toaster mated with a lightning rod. It's a Leyden jar, an early capacitor. The child charges it with a crank generator and dares his friend to touch the contact. A tiny spark leaps out. The friend yelps. They both laugh. Science, you see, was deeply personal and occasionally painful. One fringe trend involved telegraph kits, miniature versions of the real thing, complete with copper wire, keys, and an ink drum. Children could send messages across the room, usually things like hello or poo, but occasionally full letters to imaginary pen pals. Historians still argue whether these kits fostered communication skills or simply led to a generation of Morse code mischief makers. You examine a cabinet labeled Colorful Experiments. Inside are rows of tiny jars filled with cobalt salts, copper sulfate, and something labeled Dragon's Blood in florid calligraphy. It's just resin, you hope, or beetles. Either way, it's being handled like jelly beans by a child who's already got blue fingertips and zero concern. There's something disarmingly sweet about the confidence these kits inspired. Children truly believed they were unlocking the secrets of the universe. One boy proudly shows you a notebook where he's graphed temperature changes from boiling water, labeled carefully with ink-stamped letters. The data is nonsense, of course. One entry just says, hot. But the intent is pure. Quirky detail. Some sets included alchemy experiments, inviting kids to turn copper into gold, using household acids and a dash of imagination. They never worked, of course, but that didn't stop small alchemists from dreaming, or ruining the family teaspoons. Next to the chemistry gear sits a box labeled Magic Lantern Chemistry, aimed at older kids, or perhaps the dangerously ambitious younger ones. It included instructions for creating combustible lantern fuel at home. You repeat that phrase slowly in your mind, combustible lantern fuel at home, and then slowly back away from the singed curtains. One boy's kit includes something labeled Pharaoh's Serpent. A tiny pellet is lit and begins to grow, unfurling into a long ash-black coil like a snake rising from the sand. It's mesmerizing. Also, it smells like fireworks and regret. Historians still debate how many injuries were caused by these chemistry sets. Official records were vague. Medical journals, on the other hand, tell a spicier story. One notable report from 1883 involves a child who tried to make his own chloroform. The result was a 2-day nap and a deeply confused nanny. Despite all this, parents largely encouraged these activities. Science, after all, was the future. Better to let children learn early, even if it meant the occasional scorched rug or mild hallucination from inhaling ammonia. After all, they weren't playing with matches, except when they absolutely were. As you exit the room, you glance back at the gleaming rows of bottles and tongs, the candlelit tables and tiny furnaces. It looks a bit like a wizard's apothecary and a bit like an early meth lab. But it also looks like curiosity itself, raw, eager, and just a little dangerous. The flame flickers lower. The children yawn. One boy leans over to blow out his alcohol lamp and, mercifully, does so without incident. Science, after all, is 10% inspiration, 90% not setting yourself on fire. Your next steps lead you down a hallway adorned with faded wallpaper and portraits of stern-looking men who likely never played a game in their lives. But beyond this stretch of solemn silence lies a room bustling with muffled pops, clinks, and giggles. Here, the children aren't dabbling in scientific experiments. They're playing games. Victorian parlor games, to be exact. At first glance, it's all quite charming. A circle of children in lace collars and woolen waistcoats pass a box delicately between them. The room smells faintly of peppermint and scorched paper. That's when one child whispers, "Quick, light it," and another produces a tiny stick, strikes it, and touches it to the box. Boom. Well, not quite a boom, but a very enthusiastic pop. Welcome to the era of exploding party games. You sit beside the group as they pass around one of the most popular games of the mid to late 1800s. the exploding cracker. Unlike today's Christmas crackers, those tame paper tubes with a modest snap and a paper hat inside, Victorian crackers were a different beast entirely. The early versions were handmade, packed with gunpowder strips and sharp-tug pull cords that often created a miniature fireball in the drawing room, all in good fun. Inside each cracker was a surprise, maybe a riddle, a trinket, or a sweet. But there were stories, always the stories, of someone adding their own twist, like a frog in a box, or a very small, very startled mouse. Historians still argue whether these unsanctioned additions were part of the charm, or just an early form of childhood terrorism. You move over to another game underway, a Victorian classic called Snapdragon. Here's how it works. Raisins are placed in a shallow bowl of brandy. The brandy is set on fire. Yes, fire. Then, in a dimmed room, children reach into the flaming liquid to retrieve their raisins without burning their fingers. Why raisins? Why fire? Why children? All good questions. The game was considered a delightful combination of daring, skill, and possibly third-degree burns. A whispered tale floats by of a boy who burned his fringe clean off, but still won the game. One girl demonstrates, and you feel your shoulders clench as her small hand dips into the flickering blue flames. She plucks a shriveled raisin, pops it in her mouth with triumph, and grins through soot-stained teeth. You try to smile back, but a little voice in your head is whispering, liability. Further down the room, another group is playing Devil Among the Tailors, a tabletop game involving a crank-operated spinning top that knocks over miniature Skittles. It looks harmless enough until you notice that the top itself is weighted and occasionally launches into the air with enough force to shatter an egg. Or, as one child demonstrates, crack a porcelain saucer clean in two. Everywhere you look, there's a delightful disregard for modern notions of safety. One boy proudly shows off a home-constructed exploding cap cannon made by hammering a roll of percussion caps between two pieces of metal. He calls it the blaster. You call it a cry for help from the insurance industry. Historians still debate the psychological benefits of these games. Some say they fostered bravery and a spirit of adventure. Others point out that Victorian children were simply very bored and had access to too many matches. Then there's the firework hunt. Think of it like hide and seek, but the seeker lights a small firework, usually a Roman candle or something with sparks, and everyone else has to dodge it. You're not sure whether to laugh or stage a tiny intervention. A particularly chaotic corner of the room hosts penny cannons. These tabletop mini cannons were often loaded with black powder and a small cork or pebble. Children would aim them at toy soldiers, paper targets, or, if they were feeling cheeky, each other's biscuits. One boy carefully lights a fuse, watches it sputter, and cheers as the cannon puffs a tiny smoke ring and knocks over a tin soldier. You ask him if he's ever been hit by one. Once, he says proudly, rubbing his elbow. Only a bruise. I got him back, though. You don't ask how. Another peculiar parlor pastime, the electric kiss. Invented for older children or particularly brave adults, it involved an early electric machine producing a static charge. Participants would touch lips, and the charge would create a spark. Equal parts science, flirtation, and mild electrocution, it was banned in at least 3 schools and one famously grumpy vicarage. In the quieter corners of the room, less flammable games unfold. But even the safe options carry a whiff of chaos. A card game called Snap results in actual slapping matches. A dice game named Devil's Bones involves betting family heirlooms. And the Victorian version of charades once ended in a sprained ankle after an overly spirited impression of Napoleon falling off a horse. Quirky fact time. Some families invented their own explosive games. One popular make-at-home activity involved stuffing small envelopes with flour and sealing them with thread. When stomped or sat on, they'd explode in a satisfying white cloud. The result? Laughter, sneezing fits, and the occasional surprise ghost if the lighting was just right. You begin to realize that for Victorian children, danger was not a deterrent. It was part of the thrill. The more pops, sparks, and startled shrieks a game produced, the more popular it became. Parlor games weren't just pastimes, they were adventures with unpredictable outcomes and, occasionally, mild facial singeing. As you leave the room, you glance back at the haze of flour, ash, and holiday cheer. A boy waves, clutching what looks suspiciously like a homemade firework in one hand and a raisin in the other. You nod politely and shut the door. Somehow, despite everything, the house still hasn't burned down. Yet. You continue down the crooked corridor, your ears still ringing slightly from the merry crack of penny cannons and the not-so-distant fizz of snapdragon flames. The air here smells less of scorched felt and more of something sweet, molasses maybe, or burnt sugar. You round a corner and enter a cozy kitchen filled with clattering pans and the shuffle of small, stockinged feet. Victorian children, it turns out, didn't just play with danger. They baked with it, too. Here, the toys are edible. Sort of. Sitting on the long pine wood table is a miniature cast iron stove, just the size for a child's eager hands. And yes, it is real. The tiny firebox glows with actual coals. A boy no older than 6 is carefully lowering a tray of biscuits. British ones, not your American kind, into the opening. His sister, wearing an apron far too big for her, blows delicately on a tiny iron kettle. These were called toy cookers. And in the mid-19th century, they were surprisingly common. Designed to teach girls the domestic arts, because, of course, who else would want to learn? They were nonetheless popular with all children, particularly those who enjoyed the thrill of mild burns and unlicensed culinary chemistry. You stoop beside one little girl, proudly stirring fudge in a copper pan. "Is it safe?" you whisper. She shrugs. Safe enough. Which, in Victorian terms, is basically a green light for shenanigans. The fudge begins to bubble over, and the pan hisses as sugar hits the coal embers. She doesn't panic, just adjusts the tiny lever and mutters something about needing more lard. You have a hunch she's made this before, possibly better than you ever could. Not far from her, a boy is preparing what he calls toffee rockets. These, he explains with great authority, are sugar lumps wrapped in newspaper and tied with string. One lights the string, waits for the toffee to melt into gooey napalm, and then flings it across the table onto a chilled marble slab. "It makes stars," he says, eyes shining. Historians still argue whether these sugar-fueled inventions were sincere baking lessons or just excuses for a bit of open-flame mischief. What's clear is that Victorian kids didn't have to wait for adulthood to learn the joy of culinary chaos. Some of these culinary toys were sold in catalogs as scientific domestic toys. A popular set came with powdered jelly colors, tiny molds, and a manual full of phrases like, "Caution, may combust if mixed improperly." You wonder if anyone ever read those instructions. In the far corner, a boy tinkers with what looks like a candy press. It squeaks and groans as he turns the crank, and out plops something vaguely resembling a lozenge. He offers it to you with a grin. You decline. He pops it in his mouth and immediately begins to cough. "Too much licorice," he gasps, before going in for another round. Even the act of making these sweets was a game. There were competitions to see who could shape the most perfect sugar mouse or the longest toffee strand. Children would boil sugar down and stretch it across their fingers until it pulled like amber glass, then twist it into names or hearts. Or, if they were boys, usually something less wholesome, like skull and crossbones, or toffee dagger. And don't forget the candy ink. It sounds adorable. Writable sugar gel in a quill and tiny bottle. But the ink was often made with food dyes and vinegar, and sometimes mixed with preservatives that now fall squarely under the "please do not ingest" category. But ingest it they did, in letters to one another, notes passed in church, and even edible Valentine cards. Some sweet, some questionably legible. Quirky side note, one wealthy family in Brighton commissioned a child-sized tea set that doubled as a working chemistry set. So if you ever wanted to serve arsenic-flavored lemon drops, in the name of science, of course, that was your golden ticket. The kitchen also hosted many a food-based competition. Pudding flinging, jelly wobble races, and one particularly infamous event known as molasses tug-of-war, where two children stood at opposite ends of a sticky rope. First to let go had to clean the hearth. Second prize was a new apron. One small boy explains with pride how he won the cheese duel. You raise an eyebrow. What's that? He explains it involves placing a wedge of ripened Stilton on a heated tin plate, letting it soften just enough to sag, and then seeing who could slide it down the table into the other person's lap first. Delightfully messy, marginally disgusting, entirely Victorian. Historians still debate how seriously adults took these domestic amusements. Some encouraged them as training. Others were blissfully unaware of what was happening in the pantry. One diary recounts a governess entering the kitchen only to find a flour sack rigged to burst over her head. The children pretended to faint in shock. She was not amused, and let's not overlook the seasonal foods as toys extravaganza. At Christmas, children made plum pudding bombs, small, fruit-filled dumplings with surprise coins inside, boiled hard and sometimes laced with brandy. You had to bite carefully, lest you crack a tooth or ignite your eyebrows. One boy proudly tells you he found a sixpence last year and used it to buy more matches. Then there were sugar pigs. They sound adorable. They were not. Made of marzipan and beet sugar, they had little peppercorn eyes and often burst open with a filling of crushed walnuts and, inexplicably, mustard. You ask why mustard. No one seems to know. It keeps the sweets awake, a girl suggests. As you step back from the hubbub, the kitchen glows warmly behind you, flickering with the orange light of 10 tiny stoves. Children laugh, chew, and occasionally shriek as another batch of fudge burns, another toffee star explodes, or another mouthful of licorice ink proves wildly regrettable. You begin to understand the Victorian mindset. If life is short, and for many children it often was, why not fill it with games, sugar, and a dash of open flame? You make your way from the sugar-singed warmth of the miniature kitchen to a quieter, stranger room. Still dim, still comfortably dusty, but with an energy that crackles in a different way. There's something secretive in the air, like the hush before a prank, or the pause between two very bad ideas. Here, Victorian children gather around something less edible and far more explosive. Homemade chemistry kits, potion vials, and yes, actual black powder. You blink. One child gives you a sheepish grin and gestures toward what looks like a science project gone sideways. We're making fireworks, indoors. If you're hoping for the kind of tidy, school-safe chemistry sets with goggles and safety warnings, I'm afraid you've wandered into the wrong century. These were called scientific amusements, a lovely euphemism for the fact that some Victorian children had access to small quantities of sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal, all the ingredients for fun and/or minor structural damage. Marketed as educational tools, these kits taught children to create smoke rings, indoor lightning, and sometimes combustion. Historians still argue whether these kits were intended more for scientific instruction or simply for show. Bright sparks to entertain guests at parlor parties. Either way, kids found ways to push the envelope. You kneel beside a boy with a frizz of ginger hair. He's leaning over a tray where bits of magnesium curl like silvery pasta. "This one makes ghost fire," he says proudly. "Burns cold and blue." You edge back slowly. "Only on Sundays," he adds cryptically. Another girl pours iron filings into a glass tube already lined with what you sincerely hope is not mercury. "She's making dragon smoke," she says. You wait. The tube hisses, glows faintly, then puffs out a thin ribbon of gray that smells like a haunted forge. Children would often perform for family friends, lighting powders that produced color-changing flames, or triggering crystal volcanoes made from citric acid and baking soda. Of course, some of them discovered more advanced recipes, the type that could peel wallpaper or scorch eyebrows. Perhaps the strangest Victorian chemistry set was a short-lived product called the Gentle Sparkler. Aimed at young ladies, it came with dainty paper cones filled with slow-burning powder and flower petals meant to brighten one's toilette. One diary entry describes a girl accidentally igniting her lace collar during a particularly vigorous demonstration. She declared it the most exciting Tuesday of the season. Quirky detail. Many of these kits included instructions written in faux Latin to make them sound official. Ignitium miscrea sparcatum was not actually a scientific term, but it did look fantastic on a label. Children used common household ingredients too: vinegar and eggshells, flour dust in a candlelit room, potato starch bombs. Yes, they were a thing. Add heat and puff, a kitchen cloud. You pass a child fanning one now, coughing softly, eyes wide in delight. One boy shows you a petri dish of crystals. "We're growing salt stalactites," he explains. His friend leans in. "Yesterday, they exploded." The boy nods solemnly. It was glorious. Historians debate the adult response to all this. Some Victorian parents encouraged it as part of rational recreation, an attempt to teach useful skills through structured play. Others simply had no idea their children were recreating Guy Fawkes's final moments in the attic. Magazines like The Boy's Own Paper and The Girl's Own Annual published diagrams for building your own combustion engines, telegraphs, and once, memorably, a homemade foghorn. In one article, a child described turning his parents' cellar into a fully functioning weather lab. His experiment to simulate thunder resulted in the family dog refusing to come indoors for 3 weeks. It wasn't all bang and boom, though. Some children genuinely became fascinated by chemistry. They would create ink from boiled berries, perfume from crushed lavender, and even early forms of soap from lion beef fat. Of course, the process usually left the house smelling like burnt cow. Your eye catches a chalkboard scrawled with equations. One child mutters about perfecting the friction ratio for his spark wheel. You ask what it does. "I'm not sure," he replies, "but it definitely shouldn't go near the drapes." That's the thing about this room. It's filled not just with danger, but with wonder. That particular flavor of curiosity where children dare to think, what if I mix this with that? You recognize the glimmer. It's the beginning of all invention, and sometimes all trouble. And in the shadows near the back, you spot something completely unexpected. A child-sized hot air balloon. It's real. Fabric sewn by small hands, with a copper tray hanging underneath. You glance at the girl adjusting the tray. "We tested it in the garden," she says. "It scorched the hedge, but it flew." You shake your head and marvel. What Victorian children lacked in digital entertainment, they made up for in unapologetic experimentation. With sparks, and smells, and the occasional blister, By the time you exit the room, your eyes are watering slightly from sulfur fumes, and your jacket smells faintly of vinegar. But you're smiling. You can't help it. There's something oddly uplifting about kids who stare danger in the eye and decide to call it educational. And besides, no one's eyebrows have actually caught fire. Yet. You take a few deep breaths as you leave behind the smoky remnants of amateur pyrotechnics and wander into a quieter corner of the house. But quiet here is relative. The moment your foot taps the creaky floorboards, a shrill whistle rings out, followed by a chorus of squeaky wheels and an unsettling mechanical clack. You freeze. Then slowly, you look down. A tin soldier with one working arm is marching unevenly towards your shoe. Behind him, a wind-up frog hops enthusiastically into a potted fern. It's like you've stumbled into a Victorian laboratory where toys are built not just to amuse, but to perplex and occasionally terrify. Welcome to the world of wind-up chaos. Victorian children, armed with springs, gears, and a heroic disregard for predictability, created and collected toys that clanked, lurched, chirped, and occasionally emitted steam. These were the ancestors of modern mechanical toys, but unlike the plush, sanitized gadgets of today, they were often cobbled together with scrap metal, lead paint, and raw ambition. One popular toy, the jumping jack, a paper or wooden puppet with jointed limbs that flailed when pulled. Of course, children would sometimes modify them, inserting small firecrackers or loading the hands with soot. You pull one cord and get an unexpected puff of ash to the face. Classic Jack. Historians still argue whether these toys reflected innovation or merely the Victorian obsession with automata. Some claim it was a way to mimic adult industries. Miniature steam engines and moving carriages echoed the booming factories and locomotives of the era. Others suggest it was just a lot of Victorian dads with time, tools, and questionable judgment. There were walking birds with whirring feet, tiny cannons that fired corks, and carousels powered by candle heat. One particularly creative boy built a metal beetle that scuttled across the table and emitted a whistle when it hit the edge. Its inventor called it Percival. His sister simply called it a nightmare. Perhaps the most charming and least stable toy was the steam-powered boat. You've seen the modern version, those little tin pop-pop boats that chug along in a basin. But Victorian children often built theirs from teapots, adding real flame to the undercarriage and launching them in bathtubs, ponds, or, occasionally, the family cat's water dish. One child proudly recounts building a steam train using old biscuit tins and clock parts. It only exploded twice, he says, and the second time was on purpose. Even dolls, those Victorian staples, weren't safe from modification. Some children, with help from slightly mad uncles or very enabling governesses, would install blinking mechanisms, recorded greetings, using wax cylinders, and even miniature bellows to simulate breathing. You sit across from one such doll. It exhales slowly, as if judging you. You make a mental note never to blink again. Quirky detail. Several department stores offered toy surgery services. Children could bring in broken mechanical toys, and specialized craftsmen would repair their innards like tiny metal patients. One record shows a doll returning with its head replaced by a repurposed music box. A compromise, perhaps. Boys weren't the only ones involved in these whirring adventures. Girls often built sewing machines for their dolls, pulley elevators for their plush animals, and spinning displays to showcase ribbons and handkerchiefs. One diary describes a girl inventing a rotating tea tray for her toy kitchen. Her only regret? It cannot distinguish jam from marmalade. The line between learning and lunacy was, again, thin. Magazines printed DIY guides to build steam-powered velocipedes, and even a toy guillotine. The latter was mostly used on carrots and unfortunate stuffed rabbits, but you do spot one ominously labeled for disciplinary use. You choose not to ask. Mechanics clubs were also popular among older children. In dimly lit attics, groups of 11-year-olds constructed wooden gearboxes and crankshafts, mimicking the booming engineering culture of the time. One such group, the Little Machinists of Leeds, reportedly built a functional elevator using pulleys, bricks, and fearless optimism. It lasted until someone's younger cousin decided to test it with a cat and a pie. These weren't just toys. They were training grounds for future inventors. Alexander Graham Bell reportedly built a talking head out of reeds and a dead fish spine at age 12. The average Victorian child may not have had Bell's flair for acoustics, but they certainly had a healthy supply of hinges, ambition, and zero adult supervision. You reach out to examine a wind-up grasshopper and accidentally trigger a chorus of toy noises. A harmonica playing mouse, a flapping paper bat, and a horrifying clown head that just screams, "Happy birthday," in a pitch no adult ever requested. You nod politely and step away. Historians debate how much these mechanical toys influence children's perception of the industrial world. Did they teach children to respect machines, or simply to expect them to break hilariously? It's hard to say. What is clear is that many young Victorians saw these toys as more than distractions. They were puzzles, challenges, even companions. And when the clockwork finally winds down, when the tiny gears stop ticking and Percival the beetle falls asleep under the radiator, you feel a strange peace settle over the room. These toys may have whirred and clicked, but they also sparked something quiet and enduring: imagination. You tiptoe past the last of the wind-up marbles, careful not to trigger another mechanical ruckus, and find yourself in a dimly lit hallway decorated with eerie portraits and a faint smell of coal smoke and boiled sweets. Your feet pad softly on the thick carpet, and through a half-open door, you glimpse a flickering light. A small room glows with gas lamp warmth. Inside, a child sits at a desk with a quill pen and a furrowed brow, not for homework, but for designing the next big thing. Welcome to the surprisingly earnest world of Victorian toy inventors. While most children played with what they were given, or hastily assembled things out of scrap, there was a class of curious minds, often from middle or upper-class homes, who decided playtime was a prototype phase. Their notebooks were filled with sketches of toys they dreamed of making. Some designs were charming. Some were vaguely alarming. All were weirdly impressive. You lean over one such sketch. It's a kite that doubles as a letter delivery system, complete with wax-sealed scroll tubes. The child's note beside it reads, "For very urgent birthdays or dinner invitations, imagine a fleet of tiny kites dotting the smoggy London skyline, carrying messages between rooftops like little airborne carrier pigeons. If carrier pigeons were paper thin and frequently on fire." One boy, age 10, designed a self-paddling bath duck meant to patrol bathwater and rescue any soap bars that floated out of reach. Did it work? The duck was last seen halfway down the Thames. Its inventor, however, went on to become a naval engineer. And then there was Matilda, age 12, who designed a wind-powered pastry spinner for dollhouse tea parties. It used a small parasol and a sewing bobbin to rotate cakes gently on a tray. Historians still argue whether this was a toy or just an extremely niche kitchen appliance. Either way, her dolls ate very well. The Victorian era was fertile ground for young inventors. Science fairs, amateur mechanics clubs, and penny press magazines encouraged kids to send in their designs for marvelous contraptions. Some were even published alongside adult creations. One particularly ambitious 13-year-old drew up blueprints for a toy submarine powered by vinegar and baking soda. It mostly just bubbled and then exploded, but the spirit was there. Quirky tidbit: a few of these child-designed toys actually made it into early catalogs. Toy shops were often smaller, family-run operations, and if a child's idea struck the right note, say, a puzzle cube made from cork and string, or a kaleidoscope with changing scent capsules, it wasn't unheard of for a workshop to try making a few dozen. You could walk into a shop and unknowingly buy something invented by a 12-year-old with a knack for gears and glitter. The boundary between child's toy and scientific experiment was a fuzzy one in the Victorian age. Many toys doubled as educational devices, whether on purpose or just by accident. Chemistry sets sold to children were not only real, they were unregulated. Some included potassium nitrate, sulfur, or magnesium. One set, proudly advertised, teaches the principles of combustion and proper respect for danger. Children learned basic principles of aerodynamics through paper gliders and mini parachutes, which sometimes led to tragic experiments with family pets. There's a story, unverified but frequently retold, of a child in Yorkshire who launched his guinea pig using a system of pulleys and silk. The guinea pig survived, though it allegedly refused raisins for several days afterward. Many inventors were inspired by the real technologies of their time. Telegraph wires, steam engines, and even hot air balloons filtered into children's minds as playground possibilities. One girl built a balloon delivery system in her back garden, which involved helium-filled pig bladders. Don't ask. A series of notes, and a goat named Albert, who was supposed to bark when something arrived. Albert was not into barking. The project was retired. Historians still debate whether Victorian society encouraged invention in children out of genuine respect for their abilities, or as a way to groom the next generation of laborers and tinkerers. Probably both. Industrialism was booming, and if your child's idea could shave 5 seconds off gear production or sell 1,000 novelty ducks, that was a win for the whole household. The role of gender in invention is also a point of discussion. While boys were often pushed toward mechanics and chemistry, girls, though just as inventive, were nudged into domestic gadgetry. That didn't stop many of them from creating trapdoors, booby-trapped doll houses, or tiny engines that powered spinning parasols. Some inventors simply refused to be boxed in. As you step further into the workshop, you notice a shoebox labeled Failed Ideas. Inside, a soap-powered rocket, a ghost detector made of magnets and lemon juice, and something only labeled the Sneezer 3000. You shake your head. Even the failed inventions here have flair. And over in the corner, a diary entry from a young girl named Florence. She writes, "I made a device that hides my sweets from my brother. It involves pulleys and 3 decoy boxes. He is still looking." You smile. That's innovation. The room flickers again, the gaslight dancing across blueprints and brass bits. Every invention here feels like a whisper from the past, a reminder that even in corseted, soot-covered Victorian England, kids were dreaming up machines to make life just a little more fun and a little more absurd. You leave the room with one thought in mind. Someone, somewhere, probably patented a pogo stick with a bellows-operated foghorn. You hope they did. The world would have been better for it. You duck beneath a dangling string of paper lanterns and find yourself back in the streets again. But this time, they're quieter. The clatter of iron-wheeled prams and the steam-hissing chaos of toy factories has faded. Now, you're walking past a row of Victorian shop fronts after hours, their signs creaking gently in the evening breeze, and their windows glinting with the remnants of the day's adventures. One shop catches your eye, not for its brightness, but for its subdued charm. The sign above reads, "The Curious Curio Cabinet, oddities and oddments for discerning young minds." Inside, this place isn't selling traditional toys. No dolls or trains here. Instead, it's filled with peculiarities, things that make you pause and wonder if they were ever really meant for children at all. This is where the fringe toys live. The almost toys. The you might regret this section of playtime. Take, for example, the electrostatic fun box. It came with a crank, some wires, and an instruction booklet charmingly titled, "Let the Sparks Fly." Intended to teach basic electricity, it instead became infamous for delivering small but enthusiastic shocks to anyone brave or bored enough to try it. Naturally, it was a hit at birthday parties. Then there's the deception ball, a toy that changed colors when heated, giving the illusion of magic to children and absolute panic to any nearby cat. According to one story, it was used in a schoolyard hoax involving disappearing ink, a forged royal decree, and the temporary crowning of a boy named Edwin as king of the playground. Historians still argue whether that counts as early performance art or just organized mischief. These weren't your average spinning tops or rocking horses. They were the weird fringe relics of the Victorian imagination. One set of arithmetic dice had no numbers, just shapes, colors, and one side that simply read, "Try again." No one was sure what it taught, but it definitely taught patience. You peer into a velvet-lined box labeled "Delicate Weather Machines." Inside, there's a snow globe filled with dust, not snow, and a miniature lightning rod toy that children were allegedly encouraged to leave on windowsills during storms. The idea was that it would capture lightning power and then blink faintly at night. Whether it worked is unclear, but it probably terrified at least 3 grandmothers. Another shelf features baby mesmerism kits, which involved pendulums, soft bells, and the gently phrased promise of naptime success. It was marketed to older siblings, who used it to lull babies into sleep. Or so the pamphlet claimed. The reality? Most babies ended up with bells tied to their toes, and older siblings developing flourishing careers as stage magicians. One of the more mysterious entries was the dream projector, a cardboard cylinder filled with tiny, hand-drawn images you'd view through a slit before bed, like a prehistoric viewmaster. The marketing was bold, instills pleasant dreams, and encourages noble character. In reality, it likely just made your eyes tired and gave you a crick in the neck. But children love the illusion of dream control, even if the dreams themselves involve slightly judgmental goats and floating mustaches. The toy shops that sold these things weren't entirely above board. Many were operated out of attics, stalls, or behind curtain-shielded corners in general stores. They appealed to that particular Victorian delight in the eccentric and the mysterious. Some parents frowned upon them. Others bought in bulk. Quirky tidbit? A toy once marketed as the Trembler, a wind-up box that gently rattled and whispered nonsense phrases like "seek the marmalade," was banned in 3 counties for causing unease. Naturally, this made it more popular. As you tiptoe further into the store, the air grows thicker with sawdust and lavender oil, and the toys start looking more like riddles than games. There's a deck of cards with no numbers, just cryptic Victorian slang. "Twist the gas pipe" means something. You're not sure what, but it definitely means something. And tucked away in a corner, a small jar of invisible ink, which, according to its label, only becomes visible during a thunderstorm while standing on one foot. Was it real? No idea. But it sold surprisingly well. Historians still debate how widespread these fringe toys were. Were they genuinely common, or the eccentric domain of a few rogue retailers? Were they seen as educational, or just delightful nonsense? Likely both. Victorian England was, after all, the birthplace of both Charles Darwin and the Jack-in-the-Box that screamed. Some even argue that these peculiar playthings had hidden benefits. They encouraged imagination, risk-taking, and mild skepticism, especially if your weather-predicting spoon consistently told you it was Tuesday. They also made children feel powerful in small, strange ways. Controlling lightning, kind of. Deciphering gibberish cards, making sparks appear. There's magic in that, even if it's all sleight of hand and static electricity. The walls here are filled with forgotten brand names. Professor Quigley's infant curiosity engine, the mysterious dome of insight, the slightly confused rabbit puzzle. You chuckle. You can almost hear the marketing meetings, probably held in smoky back rooms with phrases like, "What if it glows, but only sometimes?" One item remains, a mysterious tin with a winding key and a warning, "Do not wind after sunset." Of course, any child would wind it after sunset. And of course, it would do something. Maybe it whirred. Maybe it blinked. Maybe it released the faint smell of elderflower and left you wondering what had just happened. Either way, it was unforgettable. You step back onto the cobbled street, the shop fading behind you like a dream you only half remember. The toys inside weren't practical, or particularly safe, or even entirely understandable, but they were enchanting. They whispered possibilities. And isn't that the point of a toy anyway? Your footsteps echo lightly now as you wander farther from the whimsical chaos of fringe toys. The sky overhead has turned a soft navy, stars pricking through the soot-dusted London air, and somewhere in the distance, a train lets out a slow, ghostly whistle. You wrap your coat a little tighter, though in truth, it's more for dramatic effect than chill. You turn onto a quiet lane. At first glance, it appears to be a sleepy part of town, maybe even abandoned. But then you spot it. A plain brick building, modest sign, St. Odwell's Institute for the Moral and Mechanical Education of Youth. It doesn't scream fun, but don't let the name fool you. This place was the home of one of the most unexpected Victorian traditions, the science fair. Yes, science fairs weren't just a 20th century phenomenon. In late 19th century Britain, these institutions, part charity, part workhouse, part makeshift school, hosted what they called invention exhibits, where children could display curious devices of their own making. And while most submissions were miniature bridges or shaky automata, there were more than a few eyebrow raisers. One lad, age 11, once submitted a fully functional, soap-powered cannon. It worked beautifully, until it drenched 3 judges and singed a nearby fern. Another proudly demonstrated a magnetic pudding stirrer, which immediately flew into the ceiling and embedded itself in a beam. The pudding survived, miraculously. There was even a brief craze for what were called mechanical pets, clockwork animals built from scrap parts and biscuit tins. Some worked surprisingly well, trotting forward a few inches before falling asleep forever. Others simply exploded. Historians still argue whether these fairs were designed to teach discipline or simply keep children busy enough to not break things. Either way, they were a hit. Every spring, hundreds of soot-smudged young inventors would gather to test contraptions that were 1 part genius, 2 parts health hazard. The most infamous creation? The auto whistle suit. A sort of wearable noise device that let the child signal without using their hands. One boy wore it proudly, unaware that it would emit a high-pitched squeal every time he bent over. It caused such a stir at one exhibit that all students were instructed to return to silent inventions the following year. These fairs weren't always indoors either. Some were held in public parks, where foot traffic ensured a lively audience. Imagine strolling through a Victorian green and stumbling upon a child demonstrating a spinning hat for windy days, or another trying to get his umbrella that opens with applause to work properly. Most of them didn't function. That wasn't the point. The goal was invention itself. Creativity, experimentation, the joy of nearly catching fire. Quirky tidbit? One entry, affectionately known as the whispering box, was a shoebox with 2 holes and a candle inside. When asked what it did, the boy shrugged and said, "It tells secrets if you're polite enough." It didn't work, obviously. But it won first prize for most intriguing concept. Even the judges were a strange bunch. Retired engineers, stern-faced clergymen, curious ants, most of whom had little technical expertise, but a real passion for theatrics. They encouraged polite clapping, frowned on anything too explodey, and once awarded Best in Show to a girl whose invention, the auto kettle reminder, simply rang a bell every 15 minutes whether tea was needed or not. These fairs blurred the line between learning and play. They weren't organized for efficiency or real-world application. They were chaotic, messy, gloriously impractical. Exactly how children's education should sometimes be. One school even kept a permanent wall of wonders where inventions, both successful and not, were mounted like trophies. There you could find the legendary spaghetti compass, which pointed to whichever direction someone said the word lunch, and a working prototype of a self-flipping pancake griddle that allegedly ran for 11 seconds before catching on fire. The older inventors often returned years later to volunteer, offering mildly unhelpful advice and nostalgic stories about when their invention only mildly electrocuted someone. This passing down of strange knowledge became a kind of tradition, a torch of gentle nonsense handed from one soot-covered hand to the next. And while many of these inventions never made it out of the schoolyard, some found brief afterlives. A few of the less dangerous ones, like the wind tickler, a hand fan powered by a spring coil, were sold in local markets. Others lived on as urban legends. There's still talk of a device called the tea detector, which could supposedly tell when someone nearby was about to boil water. Some say it just clicked randomly. Others insist it worked and politely declined to explain how. As you move back into the street, the building vanishes behind you like mist. That strange little institute, with its bubbling brains and squeaky machines, may be gone, but the spirit lingers. It hums in the air, whispering to every child who's ever tried to turn a shoebox into a spaceship or attach a bell to a cat for scientific purposes. That was the quiet genius of these science fairs. They didn't teach children to be careful. They taught them to be curious. And if the cost of that curiosity was a few smoke-filled classrooms and one memorable incident involving an experimental slingshot, then so be it. You round the corner, the stars blinking more boldly now. Somewhere far off, a street organ wheezes out a lullaby. Your pace slows. The inventions behind you, both real and imagined, begin to fade into the folds of your sleepy mind. But not entirely. Because now, you're wondering if your pillow could use a self-cooling system, or a whispering box of your own, just in case. The sky now hangs in velvet above your head, heavy with the hush of midnight. The cobbled streets have grown softer somehow, muffled by fog that creeps in from the river, like a polite house guest who doesn't want to wake the baby. You step lightly past lamplit windows and chimneys, breathing faint wisps into the night. This last stretch of your journey leads not to a factory, nor a nursery, nor a noisy science fair, but to the world of Victorian bedtime itself. But bedtime, of course, was not always the peaceful affair you might expect. Victorian children didn't simply brush their teeth, if they had any left, after trying sugar-filled whirligigs, hop into cozy pajamas, and dream of mechanical hedgehogs. No. You'd have to earn your way to sleep, often through elaborate nighttime routines that blended fear, firelight, and occasionally fireworks. Let's begin with the bedroom. It wasn't necessarily your own. Wealthy children were often put to bed by a nanny or governess, in rooms where ticking clocks and stiff curtains stood watch. But poorer children? They slept wherever they could fit, under staircases, beside crates, in tiny attic corners that somehow always had exactly one cold draft. You might even share a straw mattress with 3 siblings and a doll, missing both eyes. Cozy. Quirky fact: some families, particularly in rural towns, believed that placing a small toy cannon by the bed could guard children from nightmares. It wasn't loaded, usually, but once in a while, someone would tinker with one, leading to unexpected nocturnal detonations, as one journal described it. Bedtime stories were, predictably, Not soothing by today's standards. You might be lulled to sleep by tales of chimney sweeps who turned into ghosts, or enchanted tin soldiers who exploded rather than surrender their honor. One popular lullaby involved a sugar mouse who got eaten by his own hat. Sweet dreams, darling. But not all was gloom. Among wealthier households, the arrival of gaslight and mechanical novelties led to the invention of what was basically the Victorian nightlight. Tiny candle-powered projectors called phantasmagoria lanterns. These cast shadowy images on the wall: dragons, ships, dancing ladies. If you were lucky, the nanny would rotate the lens slowly, and you could fall asleep watching ghostly silhouettes twirl across the ceiling like a very slow, vaguely terrifying slideshow. Now, let's talk about actual bedtime toys. These weren't plushies or plastic figurines. Victorian sleep toys tended to be either vaguely educational or unintentionally dangerous. Sleep drums, for instance, were tiny percussion instruments children were told to beat gently until they nodded off. Historians still argue whether this helped anyone fall asleep or simply created generations of sleepy drummers. One widely advertised bedtime amusement was the sparkle wand. It glowed faintly due to phosphorescent paint. Trouble was, the paint often included radium, so you might fall asleep under its gentle green shimmer, only to wake up mildly radioactive, or not wake up at all, depending on how long you stared into it. And then there were dreams. Not just dreams you had, but dreams you were told to have. Dream guides, little booklets sold for pennies, claimed to help children summon specific dreams. Want to dream of flying to Paris in a steam-powered balloon? Eat a piece of licorice and sleep with a coin under your tongue. Want to dream of meeting Queen Victoria? Try holding a painted spoon and chanting softly about empire. None of it worked, of course, except the licorice. That might have caused actual hallucinations. In some homes, bedtime was when children were encouraged to reflect on the day's moral lessons. One London pamphlet even recommended asking your child each night, which of your actions today would most disappoint a saint? That's a real thing. You can imagine how relaxing that was. Yet bedtime could be surprisingly communal. Children often shared stories under blankets, lit by a single candle stub, exchanging wild ideas and strange inventions they'd dreamt up. One girl recounted building a device that could scoop out bad dreams and mail them to the moon. Another boy claimed his teddy bear had learned Morse code and was signaling him in his sleep. These were the gentle sparks of imagination, the kind that occasionally caught fire, but more often just glowed quietly until morning, and occasionally, bedtime toys went full-blown dramatic. Remember the explosive tendencies of Victorian playtime? That extended, unfortunately, to things like night fizzers, small cartridges meant to produce a tiny puff of light and sound to scare away shadows. They were short-lived. A few fizzled politely. Several set fire to bedspreads. One exploded with such gusto that it shattered a nearby teacup and launched a stuffed rabbit out a second-floor window. The rabbit was fine. It lived to terrorize a garden hedge for years. Still, even with all this chaos, bedtime had its moments of true calm. A warm brick tucked under the sheets. The scent of lavender oil on a threadbare pillow. The soft rustle of newspapers stuffed into cracks to keep out the draft. And the occasional lullaby, sung gently by a tired parent or elder sibling, off-key and a bit too fast, but filled with love anyway. Some historians insist that Victorian sleep habits were shaped mostly by utility and fatigue. Children worked hard, and sleep came easily. Others argue that the elaborate toys and rituals reveal something else, a world where children, even in soot and shadow, were given space to imagine, to dream aloud, to make even bedtime its own little laboratory. And in a strange way, the entire era feels like one long, chaotic attempt at bedtime, a society bustling with noise and fire and invention, always on the edge of sleep, always half lulled by its own fantastical dreams. You draw the blanket closer now, your thoughts slower, breath softer. The children of Victorian nights are fading gently into the shadows of memory, some curled beside candlelight, some muttering to whispering boxes, some inventing sparks that never quite caught. They sleep now, strange toys by their sides, gears winding down to silence. And now, the lights in the nursery have long since flickered out. Outside, the gas lamps flicker on street corners, watched only by the occasional owl or milk cart rattling through the mist. You're no longer on the cobbles or tucked beside the fire. You're floating, adrift in the gentle hush of a time that's done its best to tuck you in. The echoes of those strange, clattering toys have grown quiet. Even the tin trumpets and clockwork mice have curled up and stopped their ticking. You breathe in slowly. The scent of soot and old varnish fades into something softer now. Maybe just your pillow. Maybe just memory. The cold drafts of attic bedrooms and the squeaky lullabies of elder sisters have melted into a background hum. Steady, comforting, a little like a slow heartbeat in a very large house. Tonight, your dreams might take you anywhere. Perhaps to a toy shop that never closes, its shelves lined with impossible inventions. Perhaps to a sleepy park in 1882, where a girl reads ghost stories to her dolls under a lace umbrella. Or maybe just gently adrift in a steamboat made of bedsheets and brass buttons, sailing somewhere soft and slow. The children you met tonight, soot-smeared and spark-eyed, are sleeping now. Their play has paused. Their wooden swords are sheathed, their toy pistols tucked away. Even the stuffed bear, who knew Morse code, has gone silent, listening to the slow ticking of history as it settles down for the night. So you can rest now too. Let the past fold around you like a heavy velvet curtain. Let every creak of old floorboards and faded nursery rhyme become part of the hush that surrounds you. You're safe here. The toys are quiet, and sleep is very, very close. End of script. Sweet dreams.